It was dusk when Janet Jackson drove her sleek black SUV down the quiet road leading home after a long day at work as the director of a large FBI branch. She was craving a cozy dinner and a few hours of relaxation with her favorite book. But fate had another challenge in store for her tonight. Red and green lights flashed behind her, the reflection in her rearview mirror making Janet squint. A siren blared, telling her to pull over. A smirk crossed her lips, not out of any amusement, but out of sarcasm. She hadn't broken any traffic laws. The car was going at the right speed. Her turn signals were used correctly every time she turned. Janet took a deep breath, pulled the car slowly to the side of the road, and stopped. She turned on the headlights to make sure everything was clear, a habit ingrained in her as a black woman living in America. Not because she didn't believe in the law, but because she knew that sometimes the people who enforced it weren't fair. A tall white man in a police uniform approached from behind, his demeanor authoritative and somewhat uncomfortable. He knocked on Janet's car window, his eyes filled with suspicion. Janet rolled down her window, her face calm and professional. "Hello, officer. How may I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. The police officer, Michel Green, squinted at her for a long moment before answering. "Driver's license and registration. What happened? Can you tell me why you stopped the car?" Janet asked again, trying to keep her tone from showing any displeasure. Michelle shrugged. "You look suspicious. I need to check your papers to make sure everything is in order." Janet frowned, her eyes still steady. "Look suspicious? Could you elaborate? I don't think look suspicious is a valid reason to stop under the law." Michelle suddenly lost his patience, his face turning angry. "Are you going to argue with the police? Don't make things difficult. Just show your papers." Janet slowly pulled her license and registration from the document holder, but she didn't hand them over right away. "I know the law, officer, and I know I have the right to demand a good reason. If you can't provide it, it's an abuse of power." Michelle slammed his hand on the car door, startling Janet. "Don't lecture me about the law. I'm the one enforcing the law here. You're not the one to lecture me." Michelle growled. "I don't need any reason to doubt you, and I don't need any respect for people like you. I just need to do my job, and if you don't cooperate, I'll be forced to take drastic measures." The words were a direct threat. Janet could feel the situation spiraling out of control, but she refused to let fear take over. "Officer," she said, her voice unwavering, "I am perfectly willing to cooperate if you follow due process, but I cannot be forced to do something against my rights." As the situation escalated, Janet knew this was just the beginning of a confrontation that would last longer than she expected. What happened tonight was more than just a routine traffic stop. This was a true test, not just for Janet, but for the justice system she had spent her career defending. Janet remained seated in the car, her eyes fixed on the police officer standing outside, her fingers tightening on the steering wheel. She had faced difficult situations many times in her career, but she had never thought she would be the direct victim of such abuse of power and racism. Michel, now clearly losing his patience, stood with his arms crossed in front of the car, his eyes full of hostility. "Who do you think you are to challenge me? This is not a negotiation. Either you cooperate or I will be forced to take drastic measures," he said loudly, his voice full of menace. Janet kept her voice calm. "Officer, I am not objecting. I am simply asking you to follow procedure. If you cannot provide a valid reason for stopping, I reserve the right to refuse further cooperation." The tension in the air was suffocating. Janet didn't move. She knew that any action she took could be misinterpreted. She kept her hands on the wheel, never taking her eyes off the officer. "You are breaking the law, officer," she said, her voice surprisingly calm. "I demand that you drop your weapon immediately. This is an overreach of authority." Michelle sneered, not lowering his gun. "Don't try to be smart, girl. I told you this is not a negotiation. If you don't listen, I will be forced to use force. Janet understood that the situation was beyond his control. This was not only an abuse of power, but also a clear display of prejudice and hatred. She decided to play her last card. She moved her hand slowly toward the cell phone on the dashboard, careful to let Michel see her every move. I'm going to call your superior, the sheriff, and I'm going to report this whole thing. Michel was slightly confused, but the gun in his hand did not lower. You are not allowed to call anyone without my permission. Janet didn't listen to him. She dialed a number and put the phone to her ear. Hello, this is Janet Jackson, the director of the FBI. I was pulled over and rudely treated by a police officer named Michel Green for no reason. He pointed a gun at me without any legal justification. I request that the sheriff come immediately to resolve this situation. After the call, Janet put down the phone, her eyes still looking straight at Michel. Michel seemed not to hear the content of Janet's call and continued speaking. What are you doing? Do you think you can get away with this without listening to me? Janet replied, her voice unwavering. I am not trying to get away with anything. I am just asking for fairness and transparency. If you do not comply with the law, you will face the consequences. Michel tightened his grip on the gun. The two stood at a stalemate, one between hatred and abusive power, the other between patience and courage. In the tense atmosphere, a siren sounded in the distance. Another police car approached, and from inside, the police chief stepped out. Michel trembled slightly, his eyes shifting from aggressive to worried. The sheriff walked straight to Michel, his eyes stern. Green, what the hell is going on here? Put the gun down. Janet remained silent, waiting for Michel's reaction. This was the moment when the truth would come to light. Michel turned around, his eyes bewildered as he faced his superior. He immediately lowered his gun and tried to regain his composure. Sir, she is not cooperating. I asked her to get out of the car several times, but she refused and even filmed everything to threaten me. The sheriff frowned. You think that's a good reason to pull out your gun? This is a serious abuse of power, Green. Do you know what you're doing? Janet slowly rolled down her window, her eyes fixed on the sheriff. Sir, I asked him for a valid reason to stop me, but he didn't answer. Instead, he threatened me, forced me out of the car, and finally pointed a gun at me. Sheriff Grant turned to Janet, his eyes wide with surprise as he recognized the woman in the car. You are Janet Jackson, the FBI director? Janet nodded slowly. Yes, sir. I was on my way home when I was stopped without cause. I tried to cooperate within the law, but Officer Green's actions were beyond acceptable. He also repeatedly insulted me. Grant froze for a moment, then his eyes shifted to Michel, who was pale. Don't you recognize her? This is the director of the FBI. You just made a terrible mistake. Michel stammered, trying to come up with an excuse. I don't know, sir. She didn't present the proper paperwork. I was just following procedure. Grant sighed heavily, his voice turning cold. Procedure. What procedure allows you to point a gun at someone who is not in danger? What procedure allows you to insult and threaten a citizen, especially when she is the director of the FBI? You idiot. Janet interjected, her voice sharp but professional. Sir, I recorded the entire incident. Officer Green's every move, every word is on this video. I'm not just demanding an explanation, I'm demanding a full investigation into his actions. Sheriff Grant took a deep breath to calm himself. He knew this was more than a minor mistake. It could become a major incident that would attract media attention. He turned to Michel. Give me your gun, Grant ordered, and Michel, left with no choice, surrendered his weapon. Grant took the gun, examined it for a moment, and then put it in his pocket. Then he gestured to Janet. Miss Jackson, would you please step out of the car? I promise you, I will handle this myself. Janet agreed, opening the car door and stepping out. She stood straight, her eyes steady on Michel. I want nothing more than justice and transparency. You broke the law, and I will make sure you are held accountable. Grant called in a few other officers to deal with the situation. They quickly arrived on the scene, and Grant handed Michel over to two subordinate officers. Green, you are hereby officially suspended from duty. We will be conducting an investigation into your actions. Michel stiffened, but did not dare to resist. He mumbled a few incoherent sentences, but his eyes showed anger mixed with fear. Janet looked at the scene and couldn't help but feel sad. This wasn't the first time she had witnessed the abuse of power by those in police uniform, but being a direct victim made her realize that there was still a lot of work to be done to change the system. Before leaving, Janet turned to Sheriff Grant. "I hope you take this seriously, not just because I am the director of the FBI, but because this could happen to anyone. No one deserves to be treated like this." Grant nodded, his eyes full of remorse. "I understand, Miss Jackson. You have my word that this matter will not be swept under the rug or ignored." As Janet left the scene, she felt the exhaustion in her body, but her heart felt at peace. She knew she had done the right thing, not only to protect herself, but also to speak up for those who had no power to defend themselves against injustice. Behind her, Michelle was handcuffed and led away. The other officers looked on with heavy eyes. This was not only a lesson for Michelle, but also a strong reminder to the entire police force that with power comes responsibility, and abuse of power will not be tolerated. The situation was under control, but the aftershocks of this incident would certainly last. The next day, Chief Grant immediately ordered an internal investigation. Michel Green was detained and forced to answer a series of questions regarding his actions. Meanwhile, the Police Oversight Board and other relevant agencies also got involved. Janet went beyond just submitting the video and provided evidence of Michelle's abusive words and actions. At a press conference, she stood before dozens of reporters and declared, "This is not just a story about me, an FBI director who was treated unfairly. This is a story about thousands of Americans, especially people of color, who have suffered discrimination for decades. I am committed to using all of my resources to ensure that justice is served, not just for me, but for everyone." 2 months after the incident, Michel Green officially appeared in court. The courtroom was packed with people, from journalists and social activists to ordinary citizens interested in the case. In court, Michelle's lawyer tried to justify his actions as a rash reaction in a stressful situation. However, the video clearly showed that Michel was not threatened, but rather used his power to oppress and threaten an innocent citizen. Janet was called to the witness stand. She stood confident but stern. She described the entire incident, from being pulled over for no reason to the gun being pointed at her. "Not only did he abuse his power, he also damaged public confidence in the legal system," Janet said. "If we allow this type of behavior to continue, the system we rely on to ensure justice will become an instrument of oppression." After days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. Michel Green was convicted of abuse of power, racial discrimination, endangering the life of another person, and violating police force principles. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison. As the verdict was read, Michel kept his head down and said nothing. The courtroom erupted in applause. For many, this was not only a victory for justice, but also a step forward in the fight against racism. The case of Michel Green became a wake-up call, not only for local police forces, but also for the entire country. Seminars and training courses on anti-racism and professional ethics in the police force were held on a large scale. Janet, as FBI director, used this opportunity to push for reform. She met with lawmakers, community leaders, and activists to discuss new policies to ensure that no one in law enforcement could abuse their power. "This is not about revenge," Janet said at a press conference. "This is a reminder that with power comes responsibility. We cannot build a just society if those who are supposed to protect are the ones who hurt."